And so, dear participants and panelists, it's great to welcome you to the Space Live Talks organized by the European Business Angel Network and NewSpace Capital. And today we have fantastic panelists. It's Talal El-Kaisi from the UE Space Agency, Sarah Fleischer from the Luxembourg Space Agency, and Carl Rodriguez from Australian Space Agency. And as you already all know, we're going to be talking about the public sector and stimulation of the space economy by public sector. To tell the truth, it's one of the panels that I was really looking forward to because I think all of us recognize the importance of the public sector stimulation of the space economy right now, especially more than ever. And also, I think we have a fantastic group of panelists from the space agencies that are actually playing a very active role in promoting the commercial space activities. And so let me just quickly introduce our panelists. So Sarah Fleischer is the key economic person in the Luxembourg Space Agency. She was working on creating the Luxembourg Space Agency Venture Capital Fund. And Sarah, she is a graduate of Munich Technical University and also Harvard Business School. She is also an adjunct professor at the Luxembourg University, and she is teaching space finance. Sarah's been with Luxembourg Space Agency. Sarah, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 3 years now, right?
No, just 1 year.
No, really? Okay, so yeah. I'm that off the mark. Okay, well, it seems that's much longer, but in this time she definitely made a huge mark on the local space economy. The other panelist is Talal El-Kaisi. So Talal is working for the UE Space Agency. He is the responsible for the strategic projects at the UE Space Agency. And previously, Talal has been working in the UE Embassy in Washington. Was in the commercial affairs and trade and commercial office, and was also responsible specifically for the space affairs. He is graduated from Georgetown University and also holds diploma of International Space University. And I think your bachelor's is from California State University, Long Beach, right? Yep. And Talal's been incremental in for the work that UE Space Agency has been doing over the last few years on fostering the space ecosystem in the UAE. And I think UAE is one of the space agencies that kind of got the mix right. And I think it's fantastic to see the vibrant ecosystem in the UAE. Carl Rodriguez is right now Executive Director for International and National Engagement, and Carl has a wealth of experience in the industry prior to joining the Australian Space Agency. He was working at Cicero, he was working at Intel, was responsible for the business development and also for M&A and investment activities. So really the wealth of the commercial experience, which is of course crucial to impact the commercial space industry. It's fantastic to have you with us. Thank you so much for finding time. And to start the conversation, look, the first question that I have is for all three panelists is, so what is it? Doom and gloom for the space industry, commercial space industry, because of what's going on? Or is it a fantastic opportunity? Or is this something in between? And I think ladies first. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
All right, thank you so much. just looking at the startups that we have here in Luxembourg, I can proudly say that, or confidently say that most of our startups are doing good. We did not have any backlash or whatsoever so far. I mean, one of the, I would say, the downturns that we saw so far is that maybe some companies were planning to launch their payload during this time, and that was, of course, postponed. And that might have generated, I don't know, postponing revenue streams or even delaying investors coming in. So that's kind of like the only critical points that we've seen so far for our space economy. On a macroeconomical level, just in general, we might face a slowdown in the next couple of months. And this, of course, scares people. It scares investors. Some investors have stopped investing at all. But we in the government, especially in the Ministry of the Economy, we see this as a chance to really invest in the future. And we have already, like before the crisis, we already have outspoken investments that we were planning to do, and we have not stopped doing that. And one of the things where we really see as a great opportunity, or where we proved an opportunity for a room of innovation to come out of this crisis, is our famous Startup versus COVID-19 Innovation Challenge that we started in the country about like 1-2 months ago, where we really kind of encourage companies and startups to think outside of the box, use the tools, use the knowledge, use the talent that they have to come up with creative ideas to tackle the crisis at the moment. And throughout this challenge, we had over 300 applicants, proposals from startups in Luxembourg. And by the end of the day, we chose 15 of these companies that we gave 150,000 euros to kind of push them and pursue the ideas that they had that will help us to get through this crisis. I'm very happy to say that one of these companies is a space company, Globe Eye, which basically detects particles of pollution. And that relates to the spread of coronavirus, apparently through a Harvard study. But just this kind of initiative that we had just shows that this is maybe a time for companies to reflect, to stop and pause, use the resources that they have now to really kind of innovate, push forward, reinvent themselves, modernize, improve themselves. And yeah, we are very confident. So for me, this is like a great opportunity for most of the companies.
Thank you, Sarah. Talal, what's your view?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely not doom and gloom. That's for sure. I agree with a lot of what Sarah said, and I think you know, what we've done here in the UAE is paralleling that, and that we are focused on trying to ensure that we encourage you know, startups and the industry to continue to proceed. And there's a lot we can be doing. You know, we look at examples of what Thuraya and Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center have done to try to help with the relief efforts to a certain extent. In fact, actually, Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center have looked at GHG gas emissions, because we're going through an unprecedented global scale experiment with people that have been forced to quarantine, and there are demonstrable, data-driven, visible, and visible impacts that we can see in terms of like climate. So that's going to be stuff that we can take advantage of in this current situation, utilizing satellite technology and remote sensing capabilities, and that would actually help inform policy down the line in certain things like climate change mitigation and other efforts on a multilateral level. So there are some positives that come out of on the remote sensing side, I think, that are encouraging in this type of situation. But when you look at the situation at large, when it comes to investments and companies, traditionally, the space industry has been very dependent on government spending, and that's kind of been the case across the board, where now it seems like you either have to double down on that because you see the benefits that come out of it, or if you stop, then there will be a definite impact. And the thing is that you can look back at many other types of financial situations and crises that the world has gone through in the past, and you see that the space sector is not as correlated to the global markets as other industries are. and that's because by virtue of it being so dependent on government spending. So that's going to be a big indicator, I think, how governments react. And this is why this type of a title on a panel is very important, because we should be, as a government, looking at ways that we could stimulate the economy and stimulate the sector, bolster it in a way to protect the critical sources of supply. And we're in a position to be able to ensure that long-term success of space and innovation ecosystems across the board. And maybe we take the role of enablement and facilitating by looking at competitions and ways to transition development projects into big national programs that we have in mind, so that we can help create a forcing function. So these are important aspects, I think, that would be important for governments to focus on. And in some ways, you think about it, the current stress on the sector is accelerating what was inevitable in terms of a market correction that was kind of overdue because of an excess amount of capital that was funding an overcapacity of supply. So there was a lot of hype in the industry. There's no secret to it. There were lots of companies that were attracting a lot of VC capital, and that VC money may flee now, not because space is a hard problem, but because the lack of commercial demand is going to definitely make it difficult to generate the types of returns that LPs require, especially in the time durations that LPs expect to make a return on investment. So, I think a combination of things are happening, and we're living in the midst of something. So it's going to be very hard to judge or extrapolate, because part of what we're going through is completely unprecedented in the way that it's impacted supply chains. So only time will tell. But if I was to place my money on an industry that would help generate a lot more value than others, it would be the space industry. Just looking at traditionally how much ancillary benefits it's been able to induce in so many other parts of life, whether it's directly or indirectly. So that's kind of in a nutshell my thoughts around the current situation.
And Tal, sorry, you both touched on so many topics that there is kind of hundreds of questions free to mind, and we're definitely going to touch on some of them after we hear Carl's view on this topic.
Thanks, Bogdan. Yes, I think that interesting to hear both Sarah and Talal talk about the positive aspects, and I do agree there are many positive aspects. I wish it was as rosy on our side. Not that it's all doom and gloom, but the Australian economy has a few interesting dynamics to it. Yeah, our startup community, particularly in the space sector, is very, very young and emerging at the moment. It's very exciting, but again, it's coming to the table a little bit later. So, not only has the Australian venture capital market been growing up until the point of the COVID-19 crisis, but the venture capital directed towards space has been just emerging at the time when the crisis really hit. So, unfortunately, what we're seeing is a cautious capital market, a cautious early stage market, generally speaking, in the Australian scene, become even more cautious, particularly in the emerging sectors for space. On top of that, there is supply chain, and Australia is far away from many countries, and so supply chain impacts have a very consequential impact on the upstream elements of the space economy that are emerging. Downstream, I think they're obviously a little bit better able to fare longer and longer runways, and many of our startups have been restructuring their businesses to extend their runways as far as possible, because the signals coming out of the venture community here is batten down the hatches, precisely for what Sarah was saying, in the sense that there's the coming months may be a little bit interesting as people try to work their way out of the COVID crisis. Having said all of that, it's not all doom and gloom, right? The interesting thing about crises is the silver lining that comes with them. If I throw my mind back to the GFC, when I was with other organisations, the investment community was by far and away the most active that we've ever seen. That's when we sold most of the companies that I was involved in. That's when we licensed most of the technology. that we were developing, it was a fantastic opportunity for people who would like to jump on value and then do it again, right? So in the sense that yeah, there was innovation to be created and value to be generated. And I think from that perspective, what we needed was a lot more of that focus on new business models, or what we will need rather is a lot more of that focus on new business models and how people can jump on that opportunity and seek to then, you know, integrate in with the gaps in the market, identify those longer term solutions. The innovation that is coming out of Australia is something that that is quite, yeah, well targeted to a number of the international missions, and so it's in the broader sense, as Talal was saying, about where some of the government and the public sector can start to play a role in the actual, yeah, support and assistance for the innovation sector. And more importantly, it's also an opportunity, as we see it, to bring in the broader sectors outside of space into the space economy itself. So there is a significant focus on additive manufacturing, on material sciences, on data analytics, on artificial intelligence, on remote operations, etc. That that we have substantial business sectors already operating in significant, you know, profitability environments, yeah, for decades, and now's their opportunity to turn around and say, here's a growing market that, by all accounts, is still projected to grow quite substantially, and there's opportunities to be had. So I think that not all doom and gloom. We are having some difficulties just by the sheer size of the economy and the emerging startup space sector, but I think that there is opportunities to be had.
Carl, thank you so much. And again, question to all three of you. Considering that there is, you know, there might be some hesitance from the investment community, specifically at the earlier stage or venture stage of investment, and the importance of the government role in supporting the industry. All three countries are facing some challenges, and you know, with oil prices, I mean, going negative at some point, that never happened before. You know, with Australia being dependent on the commodity prices, that also declined. For Luxembourg being dependent on somewhat on financial markets, and that also been in turmoil. There is, I think, a lot of there might be a lot of desire to just kind of hold back and see what's going to happen before really, you know, deploying any investment plans or supporting certain parts of the economy. But it looks from the outside that neither of the three countries has done that, but it actually was vice versa, on the offensive. Do you think, well, first of all, whether you think that assessment, kind of the outside look, is correct, and do you think this is going to continue, or we still might see some sort of reservation and pulling back from the governments in terms of supporting the industry? Talal, would you like to start?
Sure. I think in terms of, at least from the UAE's standpoint, you know, prior to COVID, it was also not very easy trying to get institutional investors to buy into the space thesis per se, because when you think about it, you know, us as an agency, we don't typically invest, right? So we're an enabler, and we try to design policies, strategies, regulations that kind of are conducive, not overly burdensome in terms of regulations, and inspire investor confidence in terms of like the strategy and our investment promotion plan. And we use our R&D spend as well to help enable certain activities in space and make, you know, companies investable and bankable. So there are initiatives we have, for example, the Global Space Industrial Accelerator with Crypto Labs here in Abu Dhabi, the Mubadala Hub 71 Starburst Accelerator that we also enable and support. So we don't want to create something that hasn't been, that's already out there and recreate or reinvent the wheel in any way. So we want to just continue to support them. But when it came to institutional investors and our attempt at getting them more engaged with space investments, that was you know, a challenge even prior to COVID, because they're used to more traditional asset classes in that domain, mainly private equity, real estate, and fixed income. And you know, to treat a space company in a similar way to how you would treat a private equity type play is tough. I mean, you guys found the sweet spot in NewSpace Capital because you're looking at the supply chain, and it's working because you're also a gateway to Europe. So there's a great appeal and a value proposition that NewSpace Capital have. But for a traditional PE, unless they were just pulled into space because of either the hype or some companies that they thought might be interesting, and for lack of a better word, fear of missing out. They're very IRR driven, and IRR is extremely sensitive to speed of return as much as it is the return on investment numbers. So with space, you need a much more patient approach, right? There is a longer lead time. It's typically back-end loaded in terms of the benefits and the value you get out of an investment in space. I was listening to Dylan Taylor recently, and he described it like, you know, IRR isn't only a return on capital, it's a velocity of the return on capital, and you're rewarded for how quickly you can return capital. And that really isn't conducive to how a space company would typically operate. So we need patient capital in this industry, and in most cases, that patient capital comes from people that are passionate. So it's more or less passionate capital that is important to sustain the industry and drive it forward. So what we try to do here is articulate to the investment vehicles that are prevalent in the country the reasons why you can derive more than just an ROI from investing in space. When it comes an economic ROI, you can derive like strategic benefits in terms of human capital development and adjacent industry benefits as well. When you optimize R&D, if you look at things, you know, there's a common denominator between the UAE and Australia in the mining industry. And if we look at the heritage we have in mining technologies, that might be somewhere we could invest in trying to benefit, you know, autonomous operations and robotics that would be useful for the terrestrial applications that could be yielded if you can solve certain problems that are very difficult for space in those domains. So that's what we try to do, encourage those that have portfolios with other types of interests in adjacent industries and get them vested in the upside of space and allow them to understand the reason why it needs to be a lot more patient. It's just like any R&D play where you need to give it its time to bear its fruit.
Thank you all. Carl, what's your view?
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that there's, it's funny how we always go back to our old lecturers and mentors, and I was intrigued by Talal's comment about fear. I think one of the earlier lessons that I had in investment was there were three main drivers: fear, greed, and envy in the investment community. And so I think that there's some truth to all of those, but I think I agree with Talal. What we need to do is we need to, in that investment context, focus on that envy, because there is a huge amount of, again, we used to call it cash and cachet when we were investing. There's a lot of cachet in space, and the halo that can come with it is what will help drive some of that caution away and for others to get involved in space investment. And so as part of that, there is caution out there. There will be some still defensive fronts that are coming through from the traditional investment market. It probably will continue for about 12 months, is some assessments of the economy. But in terms of what the governments need to do, and I think that's, you know, getting to the heart of the discussion here, is that there are many government programs that Australia has been launching and focusing on multiple different sectors to try and at least stimulate that part of the economy and to move things forward. As I mentioned, in the space sector, the halo of space is still there, regardless of the fact that, you know, we've gone through pretty much one of the most unique experiences that the world has ever seen. I think from the perspective that the government here has been focusing on is that in the space sector, it's seen as a very small sector, but it is a key sector and is seen by the government as being a focal point of some of the messaging around how we come out of COVID-19 and accelerate based on a lot of not only the innovation and the returns that we can try and achieve through space, but also that halo. And so in the Australian environment, the three programs that we've launched within the Australian space agency, we're yet to turn 2 at the moment. So we're still very young in our program development. Having said that, we've already launched 3 programs, and the programs themselves we're actually working to bring as far forward a lot of that spend into the startup community as possible. And so there's the International Space Investment Initiative, which is again relatively small, but was very well and truly oversubscribed. And so the interest in space is there, the excitement for space is there, and that's generated a fantastic evidence base for us to go back to government and say, this is an exciting part of the community and people want excitement, particularly coming out of what we've just come out of. Our Space Infrastructure Fund, where we're looking at building capability around the nation through space manufacturing centres and robotics and artificial intelligence command and control centres, mission control centres. Again, we're trying to bring those as far forward as possible, and these are grants out into the Australian space startup community. And the recent one as well too, our Moon to Mars program that we announced late last year, we still in the finalisation of the design, so there's very little I can say about that, but we're starting to roll that out in July. And so as part of that, again, the community is looking towards space and the government actions there to turn around and say, okay, there is excitement here, there is a pathway out. And not only that, it's a cool pathway. And so it's a pathway that other sectors of the economy are turning around and saying, hey, I do those heat treated materials. What can I do for the new emerging rocket companies here in Australia? We've got fantastic, laser capabilities. How do I adapt that then to the optical communications companies that are starting up here? Again, the analytics, the space life sciences community is starting to get a win behind them because of a lot of the synthetic biology work that's happening here in Australia. And so, again, those targeted medical research support packages, the manufacturing support packages, the SME support packages that broadly the government is trying to design and to roll out in the coming months. We're working closely with all of those departments to say, is there a space dimension to that can help accelerate some of that for the program rollout and visibility, but also to help the companies themselves get access to that capital early.
And Carl, I think this is also an excellent point, and I know that Talal is doing some similar things with his colleagues in the UAE, is that at the times of crisis, when the cash is scarce, it's really important to just kind of hit on those points where you have most synergy. And if the companies are kind of from the crossroads of different industries and can benefit different industries and can generate growth and employment in different industries, specifically where it can hit. And space is one of those industries that does have crossover with so many other places, like materials, synthetic biology, optics, communications, across. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
If I just add two points to that. One is that's where true innovation happens, at the crossroads, as every investor knows. And the other thing as well too is one of the mantras for the agency that we're putting out to the Australian community is space is just another domain, right? Yes, it has rockets and satellites, but we need manufacturing, we need medical, we need all of those other things that we all do. So welcome to the space economy.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what Talal and myself together we call just another continent. It's just geography. Yeah. Sarah, over to you. And I actually wanted to slightly tweak the question when related to Luxembourg, because also there's been a change in the leadership in Luxembourg. And of course, His Excellency Schneider was kind of the initiator and a great advocate of the space industry. So there is a new Minister of Economy. So that kind of, a new leadership and the crisis and a lot of moving parts. Does it mean that the space kind of is slipping on the top in the list of priorities in Luxembourg, or is it still on the top shelf?
That's totally true. So Minister Schneider left the office right before the crisis started. So poor Franz Fayot. He's dealing with a lot of economical topics now during the crisis. So I think that's like a great start to get into the economy as a minister of the economy. Luckily, no, to your question, but let me get back to kind of like the background where this is coming from a Luxembourgish perspective. For us, our new motto is basically New Start Luxembourg. That's kind of like the new tagline that Luxembourg is following through to get through the crisis and spreading out confidence to the industries. And by us saying that, basically just means that we need to create a perspective for the future. And by doing that is really important to always look forward, especially during the time of the crisis. So we have specific topics that we want to push forward. Of course, one of the typical European topics are sustainability and environmental topics. But one of the key drivers that the Ministry of the Economy in Luxembourg is also pushing forward is, of course, digitalization next to space. And that really comes together, like what Carl and Talal have mentioned and touched upon just now, beautifully describing that basically, you don't have GPS without satellites. You cannot have connectivity. You cannot have autonomous driving. You cannot have Internet of Things in remote areas, or even like, let's say, the next trend of 5G in remote areas without satellite communication. So we really believe that satellites or space in general is, first of all, backbone of digitalization. So if we want, in generally, for the entire industry to move forward, digitalize themselves, get up to the next trends and compete against all the other global players, we need to step up and also create a strong backbone that we can enable these digital trends in the future. And for us, that is, of course, space in the short term. So no, to your question, we have not stopped investing into space. Space is still one of the highest priorities, still one of the leading initiatives that Luxembourg is pushing forward to. My colleagues and I have never been as much as busy as now. So we are lucky enough that we as an agency invest into startups. So we are still investing into companies who are especially really tackling these things that I just mentioned. Or even like what Talal mentioned earlier, like, weather forecasting, getting data from Earth, Earth observation. Those are super crucial on a lot of environmental topics that we have or are facing at the moment. And this is like on the short-term notice. And on the long term, we're still investing into companies that look really futuristic, touch upon topics of space resources. So I know that Luxembourg is very famous to be a strong believer of space resources. So we're not stopping there. We're not stopping our long-term vision that we want to send or enable technologies to make living on Mars, living on the moon possible. Finding water, extracting water, creating energy sources in space. So we're still very passionate about that, and we're still working on those initiatives that we have that we're rolling out in the next months to really support that even stronger. So no, to your question, Luxembourg has not stopped being active in space and is still pushing forward a lot.
I think very important, not just for the Luxembourg space community, but for the European and global space community, that Luxembourg is still active in this domain, with everything that the Luxembourg Space Agency and the government has done to promote commercial space. Look, before my next question, what I wanted to suggest to people who join the webinar is, look, it's very easily for me to fill 3-4 hour conversation with this group of people with my own questions, but it would be great that if we have a chance to answer your questions. So please do type them in the group chat, and then I'll voice them for our panelists. While people are typing, another question for me is, in your view, what so you mentioned in terms of how you're facilitating the playing the facilitating role between different agencies, different government agencies, and then also different players within the industry, matching companies with the opportunities and the investment programs or R&D programs. But if we're looking at the specifically the investor community, and what the space agencies are doing, the work that you are doing with the investment community to promote space, to explain space, and also what do you think can be done, what more can be done, specifically in the light of the current environment, to probably demystify this further and kind of further advance the understanding of the space sector, of the space commercial sector, and help both institutional investors and the private investors to go into the industry and focus on the value rather than on the hype, you know, so that there is, you know, more envy and greed in Carlos' words. Carlos, so what do you think if you start on with answers on that?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question, Bogdan. And I think that, you know, what we have been doing with both the startup and the investor community here in Australia is actually going out to them to seek, you know, their views. We have been you know, quite active in terms of both informally and formally going out to these various communities and saying, what are the specific issues that you're facing? If there are certain risks that are cropping up, then obviously the investors will see those risks as well. Can those risks be identified to be correlated with certain government programs that are being designed, etc.? In which case, then that will help de-risk that situation for the investors themselves. We're talking to the investors, and the messages that we're getting back from the investors are that there is a role that government needs to play in this as part of that support for the broader community. And so I think that's that pulse on the specific space sector as it feeds into both the manufacturing sector as a whole, as a subset of the manufacturing in terms of the upstream, but also in the cyber and the data in the downstream. Again, we're looking at trying to match, as you said, some of those issues with the government programs that are being rolled out, the different agencies that have the remits for communications or cyber or whatever it is that might be able to then support some of these startups, and match them with those programs themselves. We're also looking at new ways to connect the communities together. And so we're saying, I think most of us now are more than comfortable with these virtual forums. And to a certain extent, the virtual meetups and the virtual connections make it that much easier now that everyone's used to this medium. And so what we're finding is that we've now run several investor and supply chain workshops from Australian companies with US companies. We're going to be starting to replicate that as we can with the European companies, and the UK seems to be very, very aggressive in this fashion, or at least rather forward-leaning. And so there's a number of opportunities that we're exploring there. And so we'll be looking at how we can do this with a number of our space agency partners to see how we can then facilitate those sorts of connections, not just within country, but again, as the world becomes flatter through this virtual medium, so to speak, it's a lot easier then for us to get that message and that value message that you were talking about into the international context. And so we're working very, very closely with our trade departments, our outward facing trade departments, our inward facing investment attraction departments. And we're saying, what are the sorts of things that we can do for our community to effectively get that message out into the global economy and the global scenes? Because there is this investor set here in Australia that is something that we're nurturing and we're working with closely. But again, capital is global, and particularly space capital. And I think that's something that we want to again open those doors up to, and see how we can introduce some of the Australian companies to that global investor circuit. As part of all of the feedback that we're getting from the startup communities and from the investor communities, we are feeding that advice back up into the government programs themselves. So the government has, as I'm sure most governments around the world, have had a very big focus on the design of the C-19 responses and government programs. And so again, as a broad machine comes to mind, but that's probably the wrong word to use. But I think it's actually been very well organized, where many of the inputs from many of the sectors are being considered right across government to help design, you know, broad government programs to effectively get the investors aware of what's going on, how we can help de-risk some of their analysis, but then also to support the startups that are coming through as well. And I think the other part of commentary that is coming back from the industry is this government as a customer type of model as well too. So that in itself, it's, if you look at it as a customer, you put a different lens on it, and it's could be almost considered co-investment in a syndicated environment sort of thing, the syndicated sort of context. But the message that we're getting from industry is that, again, the government possibly needs to look at opportunities for presenting itself almost as a customer in terms of providing domestic solutions. And particularly in our case, in the Australian case, there's no end to the environmental items that we can turn our mind to, you know, bushfires, drought, etc., those sorts of things. And where space plays a role in that, then potentially there's a role for government to play.
Thank you, Carl. And Talal, UAE Space Agency, of course, is doing a lot for the promotion and the investment. You have the Space Investment Promotion Plan. You run the, I think, first time in the region in January, you run the Space Investment Workshop, which was attended by His Excellency Bilhoul Al-Falasi, but also the Minister Schneider, you also, you know, initiating things like the Global Space Congress and doing a lot of the things already. So maybe it's not a fair question of what else can be done, but considering the specific environment we are in, do you think there is something else that the UAE Space Agency and other space agencies can do to promote space to the investors?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more that can be done. And as we just heard from Carl, we can, use this situation that we're in as an opportunity and try to turn it around and make it very positive. So, we've all, as he said, kind of felt the benefits of remote working it's much more prevalently than we would have otherwise. The way that I think Australia is taking advantage of it is really incredible, because it puts you in a situation where you don't really have to get on a plane and waste half the time on logistics. I mean, there are some meetings over here in Abu Dhabi that I haven't been able to get to because of my travel schedule for months. But ever since we've been doing this remote working thing, I'm able to meet with those individuals and those entities pretty frequently. So engaging with other industries is going to be key. I think the more adjacent markets we try to have space cross-pollinate into, the bigger the benefits will be to our sector at large. And this can go both ways for both domestic and international engagements that we choose to have. So I think, there have been initiatives in the past that have looked at optimizing R&D between different sectors, and I think space is well placed for the potential there, especially when you look at healthcare. And there's this program I remember in Houston that I was a part of at one point, called Pumps and Pipes, that came out of the fact that they have a common denominator in Houston of between three different industries: healthcare, aerospace, and energy. And we have a similar thing over here. And what they did over there was they had joint R&D type activities and workshops that would take place where you'd have engineers from each of those industries work with each other and try to find solutions, because the commonality there are pumps and pipes, even in the human body, with veins and stents and blood and flow dynamics. And so we need to try to do more of that over here, because then you're unlocking the full potential of more brain power from different sectors that are applicable, and not crossing any wires or duplicating efforts on R&D spend unnecessarily. So that's an effort that we're going to continue to try to pursue in light of the current circumstances we're in, and take advantage of the current circumstances we're in to move the needle on, so to speak.
Thank you, Talal. Sarah, over to you. So what do you think Luxembourg Space Agencies can do in specifically promoting the space agency in the current environment to investors?
Yeah, I really loved what Tala and Carl have already mentioned. I really believe that during this crisis, people globally have come together and actually got more closer. So I can call an investor in New York City and pitch some startups that we have here in Luxembourg. So I have, like, this time now during the crisis, it has been so easy to connect with investors, to be honest. Because before that, I had to travel to a specific startup event or a specific space conference to meet the necessary investors or institutional investors. And now it's just, contacting the people and scheduling a Zoom call or just calling each other. And it has been much easier. And the people are willing also to talk just like that. So people are kind of like changing the mindset a little bit, like what Talal just mentioned. So I had a very positive experience regarding to that. So I have been super busy kind of growing our investor network in the last weeks, creating kind of an investor newsletter where we put up the startups that we have here in the country who are fundraising or looking for mentoring or advisory, and sending that out to all the investors that we have created in our network. So that has been super positive. And I mean, from the investor point of view, you have like kind of like a 50-50 investment strategy at the moment. I mean, some are being very careful and very hesitant and almost not investing at all. But I saw also other investors who kind of use this opportunity now, getting encouraged, getting excited from what space has to offer, to be very active now in the space industry, making their first approaches to the first space companies. So that has been super positive. Just keeping in your back mind that, I mean, like from the last crises, let's say 2008, 2009, there has been like so many successful companies coming out of that, right? Now more from the digital side, let's say Uber and Venmo and WhatsApp all came out around 2008 and 2009. So we're really looking forward to see and what will come out of the crisis in 2020. But we will only know in, let's say, in 10 years past. So yeah, from the role of government, Luxembourg, what we find during the crisis, especially from Luxembourg as a small country in Europe, that it's super important to work together with other countries, work together with agencies around the globe. I mean, we were in Europe, this is now a very European topic. We are very proud to be part of the European Union, one of the initiators. And we were one of the only countries that did not close our borders during these times, because we felt like this is one of the main principles that you don't do in a European Union. We're the only country that celebrates, that has a national holiday regarding to the Europe Day, to celebrate the European Union. So we always like to think local, but have a vision, a global vision or a European vision. And we only believe that we can move forward or get out of this crisis if we all work together, on a country level and on the agency level as well, and kind of like reflect now, okay, where do we want to go from here, and join our resources together, working with the UAE and Australia. I mean, we have common passion where we want to go forward in space, and yeah, put these resources together and push forward to strengthen the space economy.
Thank you, Sarah. I think everyone's just digesting what our panelists have been saying, so that's why there are no more questions. I think everyone's just going through the information that the wisdom that you already shared, which gives me a chance to ask another question. And the question is that, considering what public sector and specifically your space agencies are doing, what do you think the investors should be doing, be it early stage investors as angel investors or VC funds or growth stage funds, what they should be doing to take the benefit and kind of use the synergies with the initiatives and activities that space agencies are doing in general, and practically in terms of get in touch with you, discussing that. If you can share that. And Talal, you on my screen, you're right at the top, so I suggest we start from you.
All right. Yeah, it's very easy to get in touch with us. I'll put my email out on the chat right now. So we have an open door policy. We literally look at every inquiry that comes in, and we try to be as supportive as possible in playing the facilitated role that we've been established to conduct. Now, what VCs and angel investors and others can do during a time like this is really look at the glass half full and look at this as an opportunity, because you are going to be able to find companies that are definitely really undervalued and can be very promising 5 to 10 years down the line if you're going to have the patience required to see things through, especially in this industry. Now, I've noticed a trend recently, which I've found extremely lucrative as well. There have been certain entities that have been established. There's one in particular that I'm very interested in exploring further. It's the Voyager Space Holdings and their model and their philosophy. A company out of Colorado that's looking at, rather than a traditional way that a VC would do things, they are looking at actually really adding value to companies by acquiring them or acquiring a majority percentage stake in them, and finding like-minded other companies that they can also bring together and become kind of like the back office so that they can focus on the innovation part, they being the companies, and the entrepreneurs can focus on their core innovation aspect and not have to worry about all the administrative and legal and other aspects. And Voyager would be the entity that kind of helps enable the success of them collectively, and whether or not they start looking at companies that are synergetic in any way, so that they take a certain vertical within the subsector of space, or have them be more sporadic. That's a different type. Those are philosophies that they can choose to have. But that type of mindset, where it's, again, back to what I said earlier, more passionate capital, because the founder and the CEO of Voyager is someone who's been very passionate and been one of the biggest angel investors in the space industry for the past few years. When it's passionate capital, it will be patient by default, and that's what's absolutely needed at this time, rather than something that's driven by quick ROIs and that are very time sensitive. So those special purpose type of acquisition vehicles might be something that we see an emergence of, that are taking advantage of the current situation. I think that would be interesting. And what we saw with Virgin Galactic also recently wasn't something to be taken lightly. I mean, they had that reverse merger with the social capital and IPO'd. And you look at the amount of interest from retail investors, and if there's anyone that has lots of passionate capital, it's the retail investors, because they're not bound by certain pieces. They just try to invest in what they believe in. You look at the Tesla stock, for example, that's investing in the future, not in the current situation. The valuations aren't reflective of current situations. And that's the same thing with space companies. So when you look at something like Virgin Galactic and the amount of capital it attracted by space enthusiasts, not particularly people that were after or completely bullish on Virgin Galactic prior to them IPOing, but the retail investor interest that it generated, that is really telling. And I think more of those, where you can get people that can get in at much lower ticket prices, because not everyone can go to NewSpace Capital and invest, right? So there needs to be an avenue for people that are passionate on an individual level, that don't have $50 to $100 or $200,000 checks that they're able to cut, to also be involved. And I think that would bring in a lot of interesting levels of capital to help with this current situation, the early stage startups that folks believe in for the long run. So there was an ETF also not too long before Virgin's IPO called UFO that kind of was trying to do the same thing, but the volumes weren't high enough, because they were mainly collecting different companies that operated mainly in the defense sector, like the Lockheeds, Raytheons, Northrops, and Airbuses of the world, and put them into an ETF because they had space offerings. So maybe less of that, but more of pure space companies that are finding ways to get into the public markets, or creative ways, like with the Space Fund in the US is another one, space fund capital or angel, the angel network there, that would be very interesting, I think, for individual investors to start putting some skin in the game from their perspectives as well.
Oh, thank you so much. And Carl, Sarah, I really want to hear your view on that as well. But we literally have just one more minute. And usually at the end of the webinar, the moderator, like myself, would just sum up what's been discussion. I would rather use this time to hear your answer, and I think the audience can draw their conclusions on their own. I think all three of you told us a very sorry for the pun, very telling story. So, Carl, Sarah, closing remarks from you on the topic of engagement with investors. Sarah?
I'm just going to try to keep it super short. I believe that in the last years, we saw that industries have been kind of going through the whole digitalization era. And I believe that investors see now that the next step forward is really the era of exponential technological development. That means like really disrupting technologies that have been already existing for the last decades, like mobility, aerospace, 3D printing, being a new enabler of how to construct things, food and agriculture, and all these things. You still have to keep in mind that space technologies are still the enabling technologies in many ways in these sectors. But what investors slowly understand to enable to invest into those is you need a lot of R&D funding, right? And investors hate that because they think it's a waste of time, it's a waste of money. They just want their IRRs as soon as possible, and they just want to invest and get their money out in 3 years. But investing really in a innovative technology that brings us humans to the next frontier, you need to put that money into the R&D. And where investors have to or should realize governmental support is so crucial here, because we take away that risk. Because we, for example, in Luxembourg, we invest in R&D, which is amazing for investors, private investors, because we put that money, we put that trust, we take that risk investing into companies that really use that R&D funding and build something beautifully, and the private investor can jump in afterwards. Because there were a lot of critics in the past years where a lot of people were criticizing public entities supporting too much into companies. But I think this is an opportunity, a big opportunity for investors to realize.
Thank you, Sarah. Carl, over to you.
Sure, I'll also try and keep it rather short. So I think great comments there by Sarah and Talal. I think that there's a couple of threads that I will echo in closing. Patient and passionate capital. There's two streams to investors. Obviously, the more patient, the longer term ones. For the upstream, the more digital based, they can enjoy some of those quicker returns. Having said that, patient long-term capital is needed, particularly coming out of something like Corona. I think it's an opportunity then for angel investors and early stage investors to become quite active. To be quite honest, there's a real opportunity here for, as Talal mentioned, jumping on some of the lower valuations and things that are available to them at the moment. It's potentially a great opportunity as well too for a lot of those angels and early stage VCs. It potentially, angels and other potential investors to come forward and potentially create a VC fund in space, dedicated to VC funds in space in Australia. There's not one absolute directly related VC fund for space in Australia. There's deep tech ones, fantastic ones there, and others, but not one specific to space. So I think that would be something that I'd like to see here. And as part of that, then figuring out what we used to do, we used to call them taxonomies, and that's identifying where exactly the specific technology gaps are in international missions and opportunities that we can then shift and guide existing solutions from other sectors into those gaps, and then solve those problems that may be very critical for those next important international missions or projects, space projects. as well as international VCs. There's an opportunity out there, and a plug for Australia. You know, very, very remote, very harsh, you know, very resource, not natural resource, but financial resource constrained, particularly in the emerging space sector. But we are, again, now part of a global sector with international partners that are extremely active, and this is the time to foster those international relationships, and potentially, as again a plug for Australia, to use us then as that gateway into Asia, and in many of the technologies that the speakers have mentioned, ISRU, resources, communications, AI, robotics. There's opportunities to be had there with the international partnerships that we create over the coming months.
Carl, thank you so much. And look, I just wanted to say that to your point, Carl, about the gaps in the technologies, we actually had very interesting webinar yesterday with Alexander Masurkin and Slava Turushev, and they were talking about the gaps in the human space flight and the gaps for the deep space exploration in terms of the technology. So everyone who is interested, I do encourage to review other panels, which will become available online shortly. And so you would be able to see those panels that you missed. And for now, just want to thank our panelists and those who attended the webinar today. Appreciate your time. I appreciate the Space Agency's support to the industry. And I think if we have to leave with kind of a one short sentence at the end of our panel, then I think it would be the passionate capital, right? Thank you.
Well done, Talal.
Thank you very much. Have a great day and good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. This was fun.
Bye.